Hello again, everybody, and God be with you. Here we are, just going into another lockdown, another time when we're restricted a little bit more than we were. Although I rather like to think about it not so much as what we can and can't do, but what we should and shouldn't do in order to keep ourselves and our friends and our neighbours safe and avoid the virus. But I have another story from Bob Hartman's book. This one's quite a bit difficult to read. I find it quite hard. I'll see if I can get through without shedding a tear. It's called the Neighbour's version. I always looked up to my next door neighbour, Aaron. He was older than me by 10 years, but if any of the other kids started bullying me, he would always be there to tell them off or fight them off or whatever. I remember this time when Daniel up the street was chasing me. I don't even remember why, but he was bigger than me and it happened a lot. I was almost home, almost safe, when I tripped and fell face first in the dirt. And just as he was about to jump on me and pound me, Aaron showed up, grabbed him by the collar and hoisted him in the air. "You want to mess with my neighbour," he growled, "you'll have to mess with me first." Then he dropped Daniel, who took off at once and didn't stop running until he'd reached the end of the street. Aaron grinned and helped me up, and his mum asked me in and gave me a piece of cake she'd been making. Then Aaron went off to work with a "you tell me if he gives you any more trouble," and another grin. I always looked up to Aaron, so when my mum told me that he'd been arrested, it was a big shock. "What do you mean?" I asked. "What did he do? They must have the wrong guy." But all she could do was cry and shake her head. And then, when she stopped crying, she said, "He stole from his boss. And you know what that means." I did. Aaron worked for a tax collector. He didn't actually collect the taxes. He definitely wasn't one of those guys who went around breaking people's arms if they didn't pay. He did the accounts. That's all. He kept the books. But because stealing from tax collectors was pretty much the same as stealing from the Roman government, he was in really big trouble. "That's just what they say, though, isn't it?" I asked my mum. "He didn't really do it, did he?" She shook her head again. "Who knows? But if they arrested him, they must be pretty certain." I pounded a fist into the palm of my hand. "I bet it was a set-up. I bet it was that tax collector he works for. He even looks evil." "It doesn't matter," my mum shrugged. "The Romans will use this as an example to keep other people from stealing." "But that's not fair," I shouted. "Not if he didn't do it." "Life's not fair," she sighed. "It's not fair that the Romans occupy our country. It's not fair that our taxes pay for them to do it. It's not fair that their soldiers seize ordinary people and put them to work for nothing." And here her voice got really quiet. "And it's not fair that some of those people die in terrible accidents." She was talking about my dad. Lots of conversations finished with him. And I can see why. If the soldiers hadn't grabbed him and forced him to load their supply wagon, then he wouldn't have been there at the back when the brakes let go and the wagon started rolling. And the wagon wouldn't have run over him. 6 years ago, that's when it happened. I was only 5. And maybe that's why I always think of sadness when I think about my mum. And maybe that's why I look up to Aaron. He was always there for me, like the big brother I never had. And he was never sad, ever. People say that accountants are boring. Not Aaron. He cracked jokes and did these stupid magic tricks and was always bringing me surprises. It's like he was making up for my dad not being there. And he did a really good job. And that was why it was even more shocking a few days later when my mum told me that the judge had found him guilty. "I don't believe it," I said. "They must have got something wrong." Sadly, she shook her head. No, I talked to his mum. Turns out that Aaron likes a bit of a flutter. He stole the money to pay off his gambling debts. So how long will he have to stay in prison? I asked. And that's when the tears started again. Not long, she wept. He's due to be executed tomorrow. For stealing? I cried. That's not fair. How many times do I have to tell you? She sighed. Life's not fair. I want to see him then, I pleaded. Just one more time. A crucifixion is no place for a child, she said. And she said it like she really meant it. But I didn't feel like a child. Never have, really. So I was going. I didn't care what she said. Crucifixions in Jerusalem are always on this top of this hill they call the skull. It fits, I guess, skulls and executions. So that's where I headed early next morning, once my mum had gone. I thought I'd have to be careful so she wouldn't see me. But for some reason the streets were packed, so I just mingled in with the crowd. It was strange, really strange. Some people were laughing, some were shouting, others were crying like they'd lost their best friend. What's going on? I said to a man as he pushed past me. Where have you been, boy? The man grunted. They tried Rabbi Jesus last night, found him guilty too. Guilty of what? I asked. Blasphemy, grunted another man. Apparently all those miracles have gone to his head. He says he's God. He says he wants to tear down the temple. That's what they say, he said, a woman shouted angrily. I don't believe a word of it. He healed my little girl. He was the nicest man I ever met. They don't crucify nice people, the man grunted back. And I couldn't help thinking about Aaron. Okay, maybe he did steal from that tax collector, but he was always nice to me. The crowd pushed and shoved its way up the hill. I couldn't see my mum. I couldn't see Aaron either, but I saw someone else. Jesus, some lady cried. Jesus, spat some man. And there he was, staggering up the hill, a wooden crossbeam on his ripped up back, a ring of thorns digging into his head. And there was blood everywhere. I felt like I was going to be sick. Then he stumbled and he fell, and the soldiers grabbed this man out of the crowd and made him carry the crossbeam instead. When we got to the top of the skull, they nailed the beam to another one to make the shape of a cross. And then, I couldn't believe it, they nailed Jesus to the wood as well. The nails went through his wrists and his ankles, and there was even more blood. And I couldn't help thinking, were they doing this to Aaron too, somewhere else on this hill? It's not fair, someone shouted. He doesn't deserve this. And he didn't. No one did. Not to be treated like that. My mum's right. Life's not fair. And that's when she spotted me. What are you doing here? She shouted. I told you to stay home. But I had to come. I had to, I replied. I have to say goodbye to Aaron. She fell to her knees then and folded herself into a ball and just cried and cried. I didn't know what to say. So I sort of crouched down beside her and put my arms around her neck. I'm sorry, Mum, I whispered. I just want to see him. Please. She stopped sobbing at last and wiped her eyes and pointed. He's over there. I walked slowly, really slowly, towards his cross. And the closer I got, the less sure I was that I wanted to be there. And then there I was. I always looked up to Aaron, and sadly I was looking up now as well. His cross was standing next to Jesus's, but he hadn't been nailed like the rabbi, only tied to the beam. That was a relief. And there wasn't even much blood, just bruises mostly. But he was having trouble breathing. It was like he had to pull himself up to take a breath. And it looked like that was a really, really hard thing for him to do. I didn't say anything. I didn't know what to say. And when his eyes caught mine, I wondered if I'd done the right thing coming after all. He looked so hurt and embarrassed. "I'm sorry," he struggled to say. "I'm so sorry." And that's when I started to cry. I wanted to be brave, I really did. But to see him there, Aaron, who'd been like a brother to me, and to know that I'd never see him again and always have to remember him like this, oh, it was too much. His mum put her arm around me. She was crying too. My mum joined us, and we all just stood there, sad and pathetic and hopeless. And then somebody else started shouting. "Jesus! Jesus!" came a voice from the cross on the other side of the rabbi. You saved blind people, deaf people, lame people. Why don't you save yourself and us with you?" I looked at the man. His eyes were puffy and swollen and bruised, but I still recognised his evil face. "That's the tax collector," I said, "the one Aaron works for. But I thought—" "They were in it together," Aaron's mum sighed. "They were both stealing from the Romans." And then Aaron spoke. It took him a while to find his breath. He pulled himself up slowly and he croaked back. "Leave the rabbi alone. You and me, we deserve to be here. But he's done nothing wrong." And then he looked at Jesus, looked him right in the eye and said, "Remember me, please, when you get to some place better." And Jesus looked right back at him and said, Today you will be with me in paradise." And that's when Aaron smiled like the times he told his favourite joke, smiled like the times he played a trick on someone, smiled like the times he showed up at the door with a surprise for me. And I looked up at him and smiled back. And he winked and he shut his eyes. And my mum took my hand and led me away. And I went with her gladly. And that's the last I saw of him. It's been a couple of months now since Aaron died, and Jerusalem's not stopped buzzing. Not because of him or his boss, but because of Jesus. They say he came back to life. They say his friends saw him and talked to him and ate with him. They say that he took them up a hill and that he just rose straight up into heaven. I don't know what to think about any of that, but I hope it's true. Because if Jesus is in heaven, then Aaron is too. Life may not be fair. People still don't get what they deserve. But if that means in paradise, thieves get forgiveness instead of the punishment they deserve, then that's probably a good thing. Must remember to mention that to Mum. Oh, there you are. Story of the crucifixion from the point of view of the neighbour of one of the other criminals who were executed, crucified with Jesus. I'll have another story for you next week. God bless you all. Stay safe.